They seeded our world with a plague that killed 1 in 4. We cooked it into a cure and injected it into ourselves. The first case arrived on a Tuesday. That's how Commander Relith Voss of the Quorum Biological Directive recorded it in the mission log, later recovered and translated by human cryptographers who noted, with some dark amusement, that the aliens' word for Tuesday translated loosely as the day before irrelevance. Voss had a poet's instinct for irony, it seemed. Or maybe that was just how the Quorum saw time, measured not by cycles of light but by the approach of insignificance. The pathogen was designated QBX7 internally. The Quorum called it the patience, because that was its true weapon. It did not burn through a population like fire. It moved like water, slow, inevitable, finding every crack in every wall, filling every space between people. It had been engineered over 3 centuries. It had been tested on 11 worlds. On those worlds, civilizations had not ended in screaming. They had ended in silence. A long, gradual, mathematically perfect silence, Doctor. Mara Voss was the first human to look at it under a microscope and truly understand what she was seeing. She was standing in a Level 4 containment lab in Atlanta, Georgia, at 0340 hours on a Wednesday morning in October, and she said nothing for almost a full minute. Her colleague, Dr. Tomas Ferrero, watched her face from across the room, watched the way her jaw tightened, the way she stopped blinking. He had worked with Mara for 11 years. He had never seen her stop blinking. "Talk to me," he said. She finally looked up. "Pull up the R0 projections from the Sao Paulo cluster." He pulled them up. The number on the screen was not a number that belonged in human experience. It was not flu. It was not measles. It was not anything that had a name in any epidemiological textbook. "That's wrong," Ferrero said. "There's a calculation error somewhere. I've run it 4 times. He looked at the number again. "That's not a disease. That's a death sentence." "It's not a death sentence," Mara said, and she was already pulling on fresh gloves, already moving back toward the sample. "It's a problem. And problems have solutions." She didn't believe that yet. Not fully. But she said it because she needed to hear it said, and there was no one else in the room to say it. That was the first day. The Quorum had not expected to be detected at all, which was the first mistake. They had been watching humanity for 60 years at that point, watching with the patient, clinical interest of a researcher studying microbes that haven't yet noticed the glass. They found humans fascinating in the way one finds a particularly intricate clockwork mechanism, fascinating, admirable in construction, limited in scope, inevitably temporary. What they had not adequately modeled was the particular human habit of obsession. Relith Voss had flagged it in an early observation report. These organisms demonstrate an unusual capacity for sustained fixation on problems that exceed their apparent cognitive resources. They will work on a problem past the point of biological efficiency. They will sacrifice sleep, nutrition, reproductive opportunity, and social cohesion in service of a single intellectual goal. This appears to be a cultural pathology rather than an adaptive trait. Note for further study. The report was filed. It was not acted upon. The Quorum's models predicted that QBX7, once introduced into the human population via 12 simultaneous seed events across 6 continents, would reach critical penetration within 9 days. At that point, no containment was mathematically possible. Vaccine development, their models calculated, would require between 14 and 18 months, under optimal conditions. The pathogen's mutation rate ensured that no vaccine candidate developed in that window could achieve full coverage. The math was clean. The outcome was determined. The math was wrong. Not because the Quorum had made an error. Their models were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. They were wrong because they were modeling a population that behaved like populations had always behaved. They were not modeling what humans did when they were frightened and furious and completely unwilling to accept the answer the universe was handing them. Mitch Arlen lost his wife on day 3. He was not a scientist or a soldier or a doctor. He ran a hardware supply company out of Portland, Oregon, had 2 daughters, 12 and 14, coached youth soccer on Saturdays when the weather held. He was, by any reasonable description, an ordinary man. His wife, Celia, had come back from a conference in Singapore 6 days earlier coughing. He'd teased her about it. She'd waved him off. She'd been healthy her whole life, Celia, the kind of person who ran half marathons in November and never got sick. Not really, not seriously. On day 3, she had a seizure at the kitchen table. He was holding her hand when she died at the hospital, 40 minutes later. He could feel the exact moment it happened. Not metaphorically. The hand in his changed. Some infinitesimal relaxation of tension, that he registered through his palm before the monitors registered it through their sensors, and he sat with it for a long time before the nurse came and put a hand on his shoulder. He drove home. He sat in the driveway for an hour, then he went inside, washed his hands twice, and started making his daughter's breakfast. He didn't have a plan, he didn't have training. What he had was two kids who needed someone to hold the line, and so he held it. He set up a perimeter around their house. Not a dramatic one, not with weapons or wire, but the quiet, stubborn perimeter of a father who has decided that whatever is happening out there will not happen in here. He tracked the news obsessively. He kept a notebook, a yellow legal pad, where he wrote down everything he learned about transmission vectors, about the outbreak clusters forming across the country. His handwriting was terrible, and his epidemiology was amateur, and his notebook was one of approximately 40,000 notebooks being kept by ordinary people across the country who were doing exactly the same thing. The quorum had not modeled 40,000 amateur epidemiologists. Dr. Ronnie Osei arrived in Portland on day 6 with 2 cases of equipment, a government ID badge, and no sleep. She was 34 years old and had been seconded from the CCC's Epidemic Intelligence Service, specifically because she was the fastest contact tracer they had. She could map an outbreak the way some people could read a room, not through calculation but through something almost intuitive, a pattern sense that her colleagues couldn't quite explain, and her supervisors had stopped trying to. She checked into a hotel, changed her clothes, and was in the field within an hour. The thing about contact tracing a novel alien pathogen was that the rules didn't apply in the ways they usually did. Normal pathogens had normal transmission windows, QBX7 didn't. It had a variable incubation period that the quorum had designed specifically to defeat standard contact tracing protocols. Long enough that people couldn't reliably identify their own exposure windows. Short enough that the chain moved faster than public health responses could follow. Ronnie didn't try to play by the standard rules. She went door to door. She talked to people in parking lots. She sat with a grieving man named Mitch Arlen in his kitchen for 2 hours because he had kept a notebook, and his notebook was extraordinary. This woman, she said, pointing to a name on his yellow legal pad. Your wife met her at the conference. She mentioned her, yeah. Celia liked her. Said she was funny. She's in a hospital in San Francisco. She's stable. Ronnie was writing fast. Who else did Celia mention? There's a guy named I Have It Somewhere. He was already flipping pages, and she's noticed that the pages were dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced. This man had built a tracing document by hand, with no training, on yellow legal paper while grieving. She felt something move through her that was not quite admiration and not quite grief. Something in between. Marcus Webb, he said. She mentioned a Marcus Webb. Ronnie found Marcus Webb 2 days later. He was already dead. But his wife, who had cared for him in their apartment without knowing what she was dealing with, was alive and immune. When Ronnie reported the immunity case to Atlanta, Dr. Ferrero said 4 words that would later become famous. Get her blood immediately. The quorum observed all of this. They were not alarmed. They had seen immunity cases on other worlds. Isolated natural immunity meant nothing. It couldn't be scaled, couldn't be replicated, couldn't be weaponized against a pathogen that mutated at QBX7's rate. They logged it. They moved on. On day 9, exactly as predicted, containment became mathematically impossible. The quorum logged this too, with what passed for satisfaction in their species. A low, resonant harmonic that their translation matrix rendered, somewhat inadequately, as proceeding to schedule. Voss noted in the mission log, human governmental and scientific responses remain largely reactive. Vaccine programs have been initiated at multiple facilities, but are expected to be non-viable within the necessary timeline. No novel solutions observed. Projection for critical civilization threshold, day 41. Projection remains valid. On day 9, Mara Voss had been awake for 61 hours straight. She didn't look it. That was the thing people noticed about Mara. She could be running on nothing, shaking with fatigue in a body that hadn't slept properly in days, and her face stayed calm. Her father, an ER physician who'd worked 30-hour shifts at Johannesburg General all through her childhood, had called it the mask. He'd taught it to her. He'd said, the moment the patients see your fear, they lose the one thing they have left, which is the belief that someone competent is handling this. So you put on the mask and you wear it until it's over. She was wearing it now. The breakthrough, when it came, did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived at 217 hours on day 12, in the form of a cell culture that grew correctly for the first time. It was a small thing, a barely visible thing in a petri dish. a bacterial culture successfully hosting the viral sample in a way that allowed replication without killing the host cells. It meant, if everything went right from here, and nothing had gone right so far, and there was no reason to expect it to start now, that they had a substrate, a growing medium, the first foothold in a climb that was still essentially vertical. She called Ferrero. He picked up on the first ring because he had not been sleeping either. "Tell me," he said. "Bat cells," she said. The bat cell culture line worked. There was a silence, then he said, "Well, I'll be 20 minutes. Thomas." She paused. "Don't get excited yet." "I'm not excited," he said, and she could hear the grin in his voice. "I'm cautiously optimistic." "You're lying." "I'm absolutely lying. I'm extremely excited. See you in 20 minutes. The mask slipped for a moment after she hung up, just a moment. She looked at the culture dish, and she allowed herself to feel something. Not hope exactly, but the precondition of hope. The ground beneath hope's feet. Then the mask went back on. Day 15 was the day the cities got quiet. Mitch Arlen noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The same particular quality of silence that he'd heard once before, after a massive snowstorm had shut down Portland for 3 days. That feeling of a city holding its breath. But the snow had melted and the city had exhaled. This silence kept going. The girls were doing school online. His older daughter, Petra, had started teaching the younger one, Sarah, algebra at the kitchen table, which she hadn't been asked to do, and which she complained about constantly but did anyway, with a thorough and methodical competence that made his chest hurt with something that was part pride and part grief, because she was 14 years old, and she was running a classroom, and that was not the world she was supposed to be growing up in. He'd started a neighborhood network. That wasn't a grand thing. It was a group text chain with 11 addresses on their block, and he was the one who checked in every morning and cataloged who needed supplies and who could get them. Mrs. Petrakis at the corner needed blood pressure medication. The Okonkwo family had an infant and needed diapers and formula. The retired school teacher, 3 doors down, Mr. Gaines, had been coughing for 4 days and was refusing to go to the hospital because he had a terror of hospitals that went back to his wife's death there 9 years ago. Mitch sat with Mr. Gaines every afternoon. He brought food. He didn't push the hospital thing. He just sat there 2 chairs apart, and they talked about baseball and the news and their respective daughters. Mr. Gaines had a daughter in Cleveland, not answering her phone lately, and Mitch watched the old man's face go carefully neutral when he said that, and recognized the expression because he wore it himself. He was not a hero. He would have been appalled at the suggestion. He was just a man with a yellow legal pad and a neighborhood and an inability to stop. That was the most human thing about all of it, the inability to stop. The Quorum's Day 20 assessment was the one Voss later admitted, in the recovered mission logs, had first introduced something like unease into the calculation. The mortality rate was tracking to projection. The spread pattern was tracking to projection. The governmental responses were collapsing in the ways predicted, and yet, there was an anomaly in the data that their models had not anticipated. The rate of human scientific output was not decreasing. It should have been. When Quorum civilization-ending protocols were run against their own population models, the rate of productive scientific output dropped sharply after day 10 as basic survival pressures overtook intellectual work. On every world they had seeded, the pattern was consistent. Initial burst of scientific response in days 1 through 12, followed by a cliff as the population shifted to individual survival mode. The humans were not shifting. Their scientific output was, if anything, increasing. The number of active research publications on QBX7, the Quorum tracked these through their communications intercepts, had grown by 340% between day 10 and day 20. Researchers who were ill-published from hospital beds. Researchers who were afraid published anyway. Researchers who had lost family members returned to the lab within days of their loss. The lab logs at Atlanta showed that Mara Voss had taken 4 hours of sleep out of every 24 since day 12, and that she had achieved more in those 16 active hours per day than the Quorum models predicted was possible for a human scientist operating at reduced efficiency. "Why aren't they resting?" asked one of Voss's subordinates, Logistics Officer Breen, at the day 20 briefing. "They will compromise their cognitive function. Their output will degrade." "Their output hasn't degraded," Voss said. "The models say it will." Voss looked at the intercepts for a long time. Then she said something that would later become the epigraph on the first history written about what came to be called the Silence Wars. "Update the models, Doctor." Ronnie Osei was standing in a parking lot in Portland on day 22 when she got the call from Atlanta. She had been awake for 32 hours. She had contact traced 847 cases. She had 3 days earlier felt the first symptom, a particular dry tightness in her throat that she recognized with an epidemiologist's cold recognition for what it was, and had immediately quarantined herself in her hotel room, informing her supervisor via text, submitting her case files, and continuing to work via phone and computer from her bed. She was in the parking lot because the hotel room had started to feel like a coffin, and she needed air. She was wearing a mask and standing 40 feet from any other human being and breathing, just breathing. The call was from Ferrero. "We have a candidate," he said. "It's not confirmed. It needs human trials, but it's real, Ronnie. It's a real candidate." She stood in the parking lot in the thin October sun and did not cry, because crying required an allocation of energy she genuinely did not have. She just breathed. "How long for trial?" she said. "Weeks, minimum. We need to do this right." She thought about Mr. Gaines 3 doors down from Mitch Arlen, whose daughter in Cleveland still wasn't answering her phone. She thought about Petra Arlen teaching algebra at the kitchen table at 14 years old. She thought about the 847 people in her case files, and the hundreds of thousands they were connected to, and the millions those were connected to, and the numbers spiraling outward in all directions. "Do it right," she said, "but do it fast." "We're doing both," he said. After she hung up, she stood in the parking lot for another 5 minutes. Then she went back to her room and called Mitch Arlen's number. "I need to ask you something," she said when he picked up. "And I need you to know this is voluntary and you can say no." "What is it?" "We have a vaccine candidate. We need trial volunteers. You were exposed. You're immune. You'd be ideal." He didn't hesitate. "Not a beat," he said. "Okay, I told you it was voluntary. I heard you." There was a pause. "You didn't hear a no, did you?" Day 27 was the day Mara Voss injected herself. The trial protocols required weeks and a full ethics board review, and informed consent documentation, and oversight committees, and a dozen other procedural safeguards that existed because they were necessary and important, and had been built over generations out of the wreckage of what happened when they were skipped. Mara knew all of that. She had taught it at Johns Hopkins in a seminar on research ethics. She believed it. She would have told any colleague who suggested what she was about to do that they were making a catastrophic mistake. She drew the candidate vaccine into a syringe, put it on the lab bench, and looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up. She had learned about vaccines from her father, who had learned about them from his mother, who had gotten polio at age 7 in 1952, and spent 3 months in an iron lung and walked with a cane for the rest of her life, and who had nonetheless, 30 years later, held her infant grandson up at the clinic window to watch the other children getting their oral drops, weeping quietly and saying, "Look, Darius, look what they can do now." Her father had told her that story the day she started medical school. He'd said, "You come from the side that believes in the drops. Don't forget it." She didn't forget it. She injected herself, set the syringe down, made a note in her lab log with the time and dosage and the words, "Self-administered, no adverse effects at T0, and called Ferrero. "I just dosed myself with the candidate," she said. There was a silence of approximately 2 full seconds. Then Mara, "I know. You can't, there are protocols." "I know, Tomas. I know." She sat down on the lab stool. "My father once told me about a guy named Barry Marshall who couldn't get anyone to test his H. pylori theory, so he drank the bacteria himself and got gastritis and cured it with antibiotics and won the Nobel Prize. You don't know this will work. I know." She picked up her pen. "Keep running the trials. Do it right. I just wanted to know if it works first." She went to the hospital the next day and sat with her father, who had been admitted 4 days earlier with a cough that had become something worse. She took her mask off in his room. Her hands were steady. She told him about Marshall and the H. pylori because she thought he'd want to hear it. He did. He almost smiled. She did not get sick. The Quorum's Day 30 assessment was classified at the highest level, and Voss sent it to the High Directorate with a notation she had never used before in her career. Recommend review of operational projections. Anomalous resistance pattern emerging. The resistance was not biological. That was what confounded them. QBX7 was performing exactly as designed. The mortality rate was within 0.5 percentage point of projection. The mutation rate was textbook. The pathogen itself had not failed. The humans had simply refused to behave like a species in the process of being eliminated. What the Quorum was observing, and Voss was watching it in real time now, pulling intercepts around the clock, something she did not usually do, Something that might, in a human, have been called obsession, was a civilization that was sick and scared and burying its dead and still building. Still sharing data across borders when their governments told them not to. Still was in trials with skeleton crews who rotated shifts, so the work never stopped. Still publishing into open databases that anyone on Earth could access. Still, and this was the part that Voss found most difficult to process, still calling each other. Personal calls. Not official communications. Not scientific communications. A woman in Atlanta calling her mother in Lagos to say, "I love you and I'm still here." A man in Portland calling an epidemiologist in a quarantine hotel to check if she was eating enough. A 14-year-old girl teaching her 12-year-old sister algebra at a kitchen table because someone had to, and she was someone, so she did. The quorum model had no variable for this. What is the function of those personal communications? Breen asked. They don't contribute to the scientific response, don't they? Voss said. She was looking at the intercepts. She was watching a species hold itself together with phone calls and yellow legal pads and kitchen table classrooms. She was watching humans run toward a problem the way her people ran away from them. And she was beginning, for the first time in her career, to feel something she didn't have a good word for. The closest translation later was reckoning. Day 33 was the day the first trial results came back. The candidate was 94% effective against current circulating strains. The mutation modeling, done by a team in Seoul that had been working 20-hour days for 3 weeks, suggested it would maintain 87% efficacy against projected variants for a period of at least 6 months. That was enough. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was enough. Ferrero got the results at 0630 on a Thursday morning and called Mara first, then Ronnie Osei, then the CDC director, in that order. Mara had already seen the numbers. She'd been awake when they came in. And she was standing at the window of the lab watching the Atlanta skyline in the early light. And she was thinking about her grandmother watching children at a clinic window with a cane and tears. "It's enough," she said to Ferrero. "It's enough," he said. "We have to move fast. The mutation rate means we have a window. The logistics team has been modeling distribution for 2 weeks. They're ready." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Thomas," she said, "when you were in med school, did you ever think we'd be doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought we'd be fighting diseases," he said. "I didn't know they'd have engineers behind them, neither did I." She watched the light change on the skyline. "Doesn't matter. We do the same thing either way." "Yeah," he said. "We do." The distribution was not smooth. Nothing about it was smooth. The lottery system for early doses generated protests in 6 cities. The supply chain for the adjuvants required with the formulation was disrupted by opportunistic actors in 3 countries. There was a black market. There were people selling saline as the vaccine, and people desperate enough to buy it, and the rage that produced in Ronnie Osei, who was still working from her hotel room because she was still in quarantine, was a clean, cold, clarifying rage that she channeled directly into a report that led to 17 arrests in 11 days. Mitch Arlen got a dose on day 36, at a high school gymnasium in Portland that smelled of industrial cleaner, and something underneath it, some other smell he couldn't place and didn't want to think about. He sat in a plastic chair and a nurse he'd never met swabbed his arm and asked him if he had any allergies and gave him a small card with a QR code on it for symptom tracking. The whole thing took 8 minutes. He walked to his car and sat in the driver's seat and put his hands on the steering wheel and thought about Celia. He thought about her at the kitchen table, 6 days before she got sick, complaining about the conference food in Singapore and laughing about something. He couldn't remember what. Some story about a colleague in a karaoke bar, and she'd been laughing so hard she'd had to wipe her eyes. He sat with that for a while. Then he drove home to his daughters. Petra was still teaching Sarah algebra. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" she said. "Fast," he said. 8 minutes. Sarah held up her worksheet. "I'm doing fractions, I see that." He hung up his coat. "Are they hard?" "Extremely," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Most things worth doing are." He sat down at the table with them. Petra slid the worksheet toward him without being asked, and he picked up the pencil she'd left there, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen in the autumn light, and he did the math. On day 39, Ronnie Osei was released from quarantine. She walked out of the hotel into the Portland morning, with a single bag over her shoulder, and stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky, which was the particular October blue that exists only in the Pacific Northwest, thin and cold and very clear. She had spoken to 847 people during the outbreak. She had followed chains of contact through 11 states. She had traced QBX7 back through 17 transmission events to an origination point that was not where any natural pathogen had any business starting. She had written that up in a report that had gone up the chain very fast and come back down even faster, with a classification stamp she'd never seen before in her career. She understood what it meant. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sky and breathed for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and called Mitch Arlen. "I'm out," she said. "I thought I'd come by if that's okay." "Yeah," he said. "Come for dinner. Pet's cooking. It's going to be terrible." "I heard that," Petra said in the background. Ronnie walked to her car with the October sky overhead and a vaccine in her bloodstream and a report in a classified file that had changed what governments knew about the universe. And she felt something that was not quite relief, and not quite triumph, and not quite anything she had a clean word for. Just the plain, durable, ordinary feeling of a problem that had been faced and handled. Not solved. She wasn't naive enough to think it was solved. But faced, handled, the line held. That was enough for Tuesday. The quorum's post-operational assessment took 3 months. Voss wrote the primary report herself, which was unusual for a mission of this scale. She was a meticulous writer. She presented the data cleanly, the projections clearly, the deviations from expected outcome in precise numerical terms. The vaccine had been developed in 33 days. Their models had predicted a minimum of 14 months. The candidate efficacy was 94%. Their models had predicted, at best, 70% at 18 months. She wrote all of it in clean, precise quorum notation. Then she added a section that was not typical in operational reports. She labeled it Observational Notes, Cultural Anomalies. She wrote, "The target population demonstrated a consistent, species-wide pattern of behavior that was not captured by existing models and is not explained by any standard civilizational framework. Specifically, when faced with an existential threat, individuals in the target population did not retreat to individual survival behaviors, but rather increased cooperative and productive behaviors. This was observed across all social strata, all geographic regions, and all measurable demographic categories. Parents continued teaching children, scientists continued publishing, medical workers continued working while infected. Private citizens continued maintaining community support structures. The species did not simplify under pressure. It intensified." She paused at her console for a long time. Then she wrote, "Recommend comprehensive review of all operational projections for this target. The target's response to the QBX7 event cannot be characterized as anomalous. Based on the data, it must be characterized as typical. We designed our models for a species that, when dying, lies down. This species does not lie down. Current models have no framework for a species that does not lie down." She filed the report. The High Directorate convened a review session that lasted 4 days. At the end of it, for the first time in their history, the quorum issued a designation they had never used before. Not a threat designation, not a resource designation. A single classification code that translated meant approximately, "This one is different. Study it further. Do not engage without complete reassessment." The file they created for humanity was thick. It grew thicker every month. Observation teams reported back data that continued to confuse the models. A species rebuilding while sick, organizing while afraid, calling each other in the dark to say, "I love you and I'm still here." The most puzzling entry, flagged for special review, was a transcript from Portland, Oregon. A 41-year-old hardware supplier with a yellow legal pad, 2 daughters, and no formal training in epidemiology, disease containment, or public health, who had been designated a key node in the human counter-response for reasons the quorum could not quantify. His contribution to the vaccine chain was measurable. 3 key contacts traced, 1 immunity case identified, but that wasn't why he'd been flagged. He'd been flagged because of what he said at the kitchen table on day 36, helping his younger daughter with a fraction worksheet. When she complained that it was hard. "Most things worth doing are," he said. It was not profound, it was not scientific. It was not strategically significant in any way that the quorum's analytical framework could process. Voss read the transcript and read it again. She added a single note to the file. "They tell this to their children. They pass it down. This is load-bearing cultural material. Note for further study." Further study continued for years. The models never fully caught up. The humans, meanwhile, did what humans do. They held the line, they called each other, they did the math. They were still there when the next wave came. And the one after that, they were still there.